Okay, so that was White Rabbit, and one of the most badass parts of music I've heard in the 60s, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But this album falls as number 46 on our list. It's actually now number 45, so it's moved up a spot since we started counting the list. It is number 12 in 1967 and number 329 of all time. So the album was recorded from October 31st through November 22nd, 1966, and it was released on February 1st, 1967. It's actually the group's second studio record, and it was pretty successful. It entered the Billboard Top 200 on March 25th, and it stayed there for over a year, peaking at number 3, and it sold over 1 million copies. And it's, to this date, it's still their most successful album. So the band is from San Francisco, and they're most well known for being one of the pioneering acts of psychedelic rock. And I found this interesting. They were the only group to headline the 3 major festivals in the 1960s, which included the Monterey Pop Festival, Woodstock, and Altamont. And they were the only band to headline all 3. They also played the first Isle of Wight Festival in England in 1968. So a little history of the band, which really there's a lot of comings and goings between band members, a lot of fluctuation, but I'll try to go over it fairly quickly. The band was first formed in 1965 by Marty Balin, who was a guitar player and vocalist. He was inspired by the music of the Byrds and Simon and Garfunkel, so was kind of into the folk rock scene. And he was also inspired by the British invasion, so he wanted to start a band. He actually purchased a former pizza parlor in San Francisco and converted it into a music club, which he called the Matrix. And then he started seeking out people to join his band. He met guitarist and vocalist Paul Cantor at another club in San Francisco. He had been playing in the city as an artist, as a folk artist, alongside people like Jerry Garcia, David Crosby, and Janis Joplin. And they also then recruited female singer Signe Tolley Anderson, and then later Jorma Kaukonen. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but Kaukonen, something. Not gonna work here anymore.
I knew you were going there.
So another guitarist. So I found it interesting that 3 of the first 4 members were all guitarists and vocalists. But Cantor knew him from Santa Clara University, and he joined the band. And he was the one actually that came up with the band's name, which is kind of it's a different name, and I wish I had a better story than this, but he essentially just had a friend who came up with funny names for people, and this guy gave Kaukonen the nickname Blind Thomas Jefferson Airplane after a blues pioneer named Blind Lemon Jefferson. And so when the band was trying to kick around names, Jorma Kaukonen was just like, hey, I got a funny, weird name for you, so they became Jefferson Airplane. Later, they hired drummer Jerry Peliquin and Bob Harvey as the bassist, and they rounded up the original lineup. And they started more as a folk band, but later expanded to more pop and electric music after being inspired by the Beatles, the Byrds, and Love and Spoonful. But shortly after, so now you're dealing with a whole lot of shifting in the band. The drummer Peliquin quit for his disdain over the other members' drug use, which I'm sure he didn't last too long because those guys were probably doing drugs fairly early on. So then they hired Skip Spence, who joined the band as the drummer, and they weren't satisfied with Harvey's bass playing, and then they hired Jack Cassidy, who was a friend of Kaukonen's from Washington, D.C. So the band's skills really improved rapidly after being pretty prominent in the scene in San Francisco, playing a variety of shows. And at one point, a veteran jazz critic saw them play a show at the Matrix, Ralph J. Gleason of the San Francisco Chronicle, and he proclaimed them, quote, one of the best bands ever. And so they started getting all this buzz. And in 1965, they played one of the first of many happenings in San Francisco at the Longshoremen's Hall, where they were supported by another group called the Great Society, which featured Grace Slick on vocals. So that was their first introduction to Grace Slick. They signed a record contract later in November 1965, and after their debut album was released in 1966, they replaced the drummer Skip Spence with Spencer Dryden, and their Their first album was released in September of '66 and sold enough to earn a Gold Award, which I didn't know what a Gold Award was. It apparently is an award if you earn $1 million in sales. So that probably means something different in 1966 than it does today for inflation. But they did get success initially with that first record. And later in '66, Signe Anderson gave birth to her first child, and she left the band to go be a mother. So that's when they recruited Grace Slick from that band, The Great Society, and she joined, rounding out which is what's known as the classic Jefferson Airplane lineup. So Grace Slick was very pivotal. This was a big move for the band, and she was very important to their breakthrough with this album. For a couple of reasons. Number one, she had a unique voice, and she sang with what is called a contralto tone, which I never knew what that was, and apparently it is what's considered one of the lowest registers vocally for a female, contralto. So she had a unique voice, and she also had really good stage presence, and she was a former model, so she was also smoking hot, which was probably a benefit to the band as well. So she had already recorded "Somebody to Love," which was which was like the breakthrough song for this group, with her previous band. That was actually written by her brother-in-law, Darby Slick, and it was produced by Sylvester Stewart. Combing the Stacks trivia: who is Sylvester Stewart also known as?
Speedy King.
Speedy King would be an amazing answer if that were correct. But no, John, you're right. Sly Stone. Sylvester Stewart is Sly Stone. So he had some work in here. So very good. So the name of the record, so they go to record this record, and Jerry Garcia is featured prominently on here. And he came up with the name of the record when he mentioned that when it was being finished up, he said that the album sounded, quote, as surrealistic as a pillow is soft. And they thought that was a cool way to name the album, and they did. Garcia is known as the shadow producer of this record, and the record company, for some reason, would not give him any production credit, so they listed him on the album as a spiritual advisor. But he also did play several instruments on this. And despite the fact... Yeah, exactly. And despite the fact that they had several guitarists, Garcia's guitar is all over this album, so...
Yes, that's
yeah,
for sure.
It's kind of interesting.
Do you think that led to him to say, forget these studio albums, now I'm just going to exist by doing millions and millions of bootlegs for the rest of my career? So I don't
Very well could be. He made a lot of money doing that, so you can't fault him for that. So this was a breakthrough record for the band. Somebody Love and White Rabbit became major U.S. hits. Somebody Love reached number 5. White Rabbit reached number 8 on the Billboard singles chart. And by late 1967, the Jefferson Airplane, or the Airplane, as they were affectionately known as, were national and international stars and became one of the hottest groups in the United States. So that's a little history of the band and the record. Let's go into our feelings here. Josh, first of all, did you know this record before? What was your knowledge going into it?
No knowledge of the record other than the 2 hits.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I did not like this album. And I was a little worried coming in that I wouldn't like it. And it proved me right, because the only good thing about this band is Grace Slick. And the only 2 songs I like are the ones that she sings lead on.
Why did you think going into it that you didn't? Why were you feeling that way?
Well, just I guess the reputation with the psychedelic rock kind of put me in a mindset that it wasn't going to be my cup of tea. But this album has no edge to it. It's so like mellow, and it reminds me of Fairport Convention or something, and I don't like all of the songs that Marty Ballin sings on. I don't like. They're too slow and like just they're like love songs or mellow chill out songs, I guess would be a way to say it. And there was no strong there was no like catchy songs or strong like guitar parts. There was I got some recorder on one song, I think I heard.
Josh, what's worse, recorder or kazoo?
A kazoo. Okay. And circus sounds are worse than recorder. And it really just was. It's like in that Venn diagram of psychedelic rock that I don't like at all. I thought it was going to be, I was expecting more maybe of something like Big Brother and the Holding Company, because I think Somebody to Love and White Rabbit are so different than the rest of the album. And since that's what I knew, I was expecting other songs like that, and there weren't any other songs like that.
Yeah. Okay. All right, John, your knowledge of the record going into it and your thoughts?
I realized coming into this that I know a lot of Jefferson Airplane songs, but I don't know if I've actually sat and listened to a Jefferson Airplane album ever, which was kind of an interesting revelation for me. I really like this album a lot. It, to me, was what psychedelic rock sounds like when it's good. And it's an interesting comparison Josh makes to Big Brother and the Holding Company, because I know that I was more of a fan of that album than you guys were, and I think there are some similarities there. But compared to something like the 13th Floor Elevators, which was more unfocused, I thought the quality of the songs on this album was really strong. I thought the guitar playing was particularly strong. I like the way the songs were constructed. I would agree that some, especially White Rabbit, sounds a lot different than the rest of this album. And I think you mentioned it, Matt, but I was just curious about that. And the two songs, Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, they were brought from another band, right? And then the other stuff was, and
Grace,
you can kind of tell because they sound different. But to me, it was very hard for me in the opening to not pick She Has Funny Cars as the lead-in, because I didn't want to just, I really didn't want to go with just the singles, because I think that's what people think of. And I thought this album deserved a little bit better than that, because I really enjoyed it. I thought the guitar was, and it surprised me, because I've been pretty vocal about not loving psychedelic rock on here. I certainly am by no means a huge Grateful Dead fan, and it's interesting because I was able to identify Jerry Garcia's playing, or Jerry Garcia-esque playing, so that makes sense. But it really worked in this album, and Grace Slick as a front woman's fantastic. And I always like artists that have multiple singers, because it feels like you're listening to multiple albums. And I particularly like that on this. It was actually a really well-produced album for the time it was made, too, especially when you listen to it in headphones. Stuff really pops off pops out when you're listening to it, but not in the way of some of the other bands that we've listened to in terms of individual instrumentation. It's more just the general sound of the band.
Right.
And whereas somebody like the 13th Floor Elevators, who I keep comparing it to, but that's the other real psychedelic thing we did, it kind of blended together in production and was sort of mushed together. This one was a lot more like how I felt like about the United States of America album that we did, that there was a lot of interesting stuff. It was a lot of mood music. I like that it took me a lot of places, and I listened to it a couple of times, and I liked it every time I listened to it. So for me, strong thumbs up.
Okay.
I will agree that it's well produced, but I guess it just annoyed me that too often Grace Slick was relegated to the background or just singing harmonies or something, when she should be in front more on more of the songs. But I understand, I guess she came in late and maybe that wasn't her role at the time, but highlight the best part of your group, and that's her. So
there's certain songs though that I couldn't see her singing. Some of the slower songs I feel like would have become like dirges with her, as much as I like her voice. And I don't know if I had as much of a problem with Marty Bellin's voice as you did, because I felt like in those tracks they were more instrumentation heavy, and I almost feel like they picked certain songs to not have Grace Slick on to show off a little bit more virtuoso quality in terms of their musicianship. That was when the guitars really jumped off, and some of the more unique choices of instrumentation came in as well. They slowed down the pace and altered the pace quite a bit. And that's another thing about this album. The pacing to get to the choruses wasn't always structured, but not in a bad, distracting way or unfocused way, more in an interesting way for me.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys have any thoughts on, John, you mentioned the guitar parts. Do you know what songs stuck out to you as far as
I'll
that
go
goes?
back to that, but I kind of want to hear what Matt's take is, because
Sure.
we have kind of like a stalemate right now, and neither of us are wrong or right. So I'm not going to say Matt's going to break it, because opinions are opinions, but I'm interested to see what he has to say.
So I've actually known this. This is one of the fewer records that we've covered that I've known for a while.
Oh, wow, okay.
I've actually I own this album. I first got it. I think my brother introduced me to White Rabbit, and he was like, "You got to hear this song." At least I think he might have been in college or something, and so that was like. I mean, that to me is by far the best song of this record. I mean, that is a fantastic song. The way that it builds, it's cool as hell. I mean, just I don't even care about the lyrics. It's all about drug references and stuff. But I just think that the construction of that song is just fantastic. So that was very appealing to me, and I probably knew Somebody to Love because that's just in it's like in the cable guide. Yeah, it's all the movies and stuff. Yeah, exactly. So it's on commercial. It's a fairly well known song. So I got the record, and I have mixed feelings on this. I think overall, I would say that I like this album a little bit more than I did going into this week, but overall, I'm not a huge fan of this either. I'm a little bit more on Josh's side here. I think it's a little uneven for me, and I think it's particularly the beginning of the record. I think the first side is got some real clunkers on it. I just don't. I never like My Best Friend, Today, Coming Back to Me. By the time Coming Back to Me comes on, I want to fall asleep. There's not much there for me. There's not much. I'm not getting the melody's not striking with me. The vocals aren't really striking with me. And I agree. I'm left a little wanting, for more. And I was expecting when I got the record, I was like, oh, I thought more of it would be like White Rabbit, and it's just not. I do think the second side picks up a little bit more. And actually, I noticed on this song, DCBA 25. Which I didn't think of before, but as I listened to it this past week, John, that reminds me of an REM song. That sounds like, early REM. And I'm like, this is like Fables of the Reconstruction REM here,
Josh talked about guitar parts that really stood out. And I was going to say DCBA 25 has like it veers into the jangle sound that I like so much.
Yeah.
And outside of that song, when you were saying they were influenced by the Byrds, I would have said, I don't really know where you're getting that from, but that's a really good comparison, Matt. Like that Fables of the Reconstruction era REM is what that sounds like. That's by far my favorite song on the second half of the album. Mm-hmm. I like White Rabbit. Don't get me. I don't think I adore it as much as you two do. I think it's like to me the ultimate like drug haze song. And I need to have something in lyrics, and the lyrics are just a really stupid Alice in Wonderland, using drugs. What if Alice used drugs type? And it's like that loses me like instantaneously. But as a composition, it's very strong.
Yes.
I think the first half of the album's better than the second half of the album outside of those two albums though, or those two songs, DCBA 25 and White Rabbit.
Well, I really like Embryonic Journey. Like I think that's the instrumental piece that Jorma Kaukonen plays on it, and that's basically him play. That's something that he composed earlier in the decade, like in 1962, and that's kind of like an homage to the band's folk roots. I think that's just a really cool guitar part. I was just thinking, listening to this, I'm like, I could listen to more of this if they did, put more of that on the record. I don't know if I would necessarily want to listen to 30 to 40 minutes of that straight, but I could do more with that. I think that's just a really cool guitar part, and the way that it leads into White Rabbit, I really like that.
Well, you liked Fairport Convention a lot too, and Josh referenced them earlier, and to me, that's a sort of a throwback to that sound.
It's like a folkier thing, but it's like it's just a really cool acoustic borderline classical guitar part. And I like How Do You Feel? I think that's the Recorder song. I think that stands out for me, and I don't mind the Recorder or whatever. I can play the hell out of Mary Had a Little Lamb on that. So
it is the Recorder song. I'd say that derisively.
Yeah, I don't mind that. I'm fine with it because I think it's I enjoy that song. Plastic Fantastic Lover. It's just a lot of this is hitting.
Wow, you and I are like totally opposite in terms of the songs that we like. I bet you if we read the list down, every song that you liked would be the songs I didn't like as much, and every song that I liked is the opposite. Because just reverse everything, and that's how I feel about the album. Pretty much.
To me, it doesn't do a whole lot. I got a little bit more out of it in this past week as I listened to it more intently, but I'm left a little disappointed. I think I would say it's overrated. I don't get it. I get some of the stronger songs, and like I said, that the song construction of White Rabbit is fantastic in the way that it builds, and that's the part I'm gonna put in the song leading into this, because I think it's so badass. It's great. But yeah, it's just, I don't know. it's not really something I want to go back to a whole lot. It's just not hitting it for me.
It doesn't even sound very psychedelic to me, other than White Rabbit. Like, it just sounds more like folk rock almost in parts. There's a country guitar in one song too, and My Best Friend, I heard some country sounding song in that.
Yeah, it doesn't have like a traditional psychedelic, it's not like a 13th floor elevators. You hear that, right? And you're like, wow, that sounds like the quote unquote psychedelic rock. And I would say that it is psychedelic rock, but it's kind of like at the beginnings of it, and they're infusing other things, but it doesn't become like the cliche psychedelic rock that you would expect, because that's just what a lot of times what you think of is something more like the 13th floor elevators.
Well,
but
Josh always talks about the carnival sound, and this album definitely doesn't have that carnival sound that psychedelic rock can have sometimes that we've talked about. It's not as nakedly experimental as something like the United States of America album, which I know that I am way on the record as enjoying more than the rest of the panel. So that's not a negative thing for me to say that, but I think it's always interesting when we have disagreements. It's better sometimes than when we all agree or can clearly disagree. And I do think that the song construction across the board is very interesting. And I think that having a female lead singer in 1966, there just aren't a lot of other bands that are doing that. And in a lot of ways, I think Jefferson Airplane took the folk sound that lots of other bands were taking and slowly bringing into rock, like Simon and Garfunkel and Bob Dylan, and they just crossed it over entirely into the Threshold with a clear fusion of what would be harder rock with folk music. And I enjoyed, I enjoyed some of the songs in terms lyrically as well earlier in the album.
Like, that's what I was just going to ask you, like something like Coming Back to Me. I think that's the one that stands out to me the most as being like the one that I dislike the most. So, I don't want to ask you this. Yeah. It didn't do anything for me. It slogged. It was boring. There was no hook. There was nothing about that song that grabbed me in any way. And I'm curious as to
song. Yeah.
But I'm curious as to what it was about. Because I hate asking this question because sometimes it's hard to describe. But John, like what could you say about that song that was really poignant for you?
I liked the pacing of the song. I didn't think that. I thought it had just enough intricacy from part to part, small intricacies that built upon each other, that it also is about timing for me on an album and where it was placed at number 5. You'd had 4 songs at about, I don't have it in front, but they were all about almost exactly 3 minutes, the first 4 songs.
Yes,
and then if you're going to throw a 5-minute song in there, it was the right time to do it. And once again, it sort of served as an interlude to me between what I considered to be the first half of the album and then what was the second half of the album. And the second half of the album was definitely more acoustic, less plugged in, less ambient. And maybe that's what the first half of the album had, a little bit of ambient sound to it at parts that I really liked. I was able to get into the headspace. And Coming Back to Me almost felt like the transition out of side 1 and into side 2. So the placement of it, the small little intricacies of the guitar playing, they run this, they not necessarily in terms of the notes, but they run the scale in terms of sounds also in some of the earlier songs, which I really enjoy. And I don't know, it's.
So would you say that if it was placed differently, you might feel differently about the song?
Yes, especially if there were other songs that were super long on the album.
Okay.
But there aren't a ton, if you look at the real album.
And I think I can appreciate
In the Morning's long, but it's the last song pretty much of the album at the end. And I don't like In the Morning as much as I like...
In the Morning isn't on the... Actually, is a part of the Boza.
Right.
Yeah, this ended with Plastic Fantastic Lover.
If you can't by now know that every single 60s band had to have at least one lengthy song to show their art, you know what I mean? And even some of the sacred cows, like the Stones and the Beatles, were guilty of this, putting on those type tracks.
And that's fine. And I'm fine with like placement on the album. I'm fine with a longer song and the pacing and all that stuff. I just the song itself, like, take all that away. If I just put that song on, it's doing absolutely nothing for me. And I'm just like, can we just get to the next song? You know what I mean? So I just, it's interesting to me that that the placement and the way that it plays out in the record. Although I understand what you're saying, it's interesting that you might feel differently just about the song if it were placed differently in the.
It's also a really good song lyrically, and that's where it's hard for me to talk about lyric stuff because I know you guys really aren't digging into the lyric, and that's not designed to be. That didn't I hope
you
that
think,
doesn't come
John.
off,
You think I'm dumb, don't you? You think,
no,
come on.
That's what I'm saying. I'm hoping it doesn't come off. That's not what I'm going for. But it's impossible to totally convey why I like that song if you're not reading the lyrics, because then you're just listening to the music part of it. And it's why a song like White Rabbit for me doesn't reach the heights that it does for you. Because if you're going to put words on a song and the words are ridiculous, then you should have just done it as an instrumental piece. And that's, that's not to take away from Right Rabbit. It's a great song, but it's,
See, in a situation like that, for me, her voice to me is another instrument, right? And I'm like, whatever you're saying, I don't care. If the song is that badass, I don't care what you're saying, because that to me is what would take me, take that away from me. So,
I mean, we've talked about psychedelic rock before and kind of the definition of it, and I guess I think of psychedelic rock as trying to push the boundaries a little bit, and I don't hear that at all on this album, and I don't really hear the fusion that John mentioned either. So I guess I don't understand why this band was so revolutionary or popular at the time.
Well, who sounded like them in 1966, Josh? Like, no one at all. And that's like, I think that's where it's like you're looking at it in this catalog of, oh, I have all these albums from 1967 and 68 and 69, which exploded rock music. And it's kind of like going back and going, what was the big deal about Elvis? It's like, well, like if you understand that basically there was nothing like the production and package that Elvis was, right, on the mainstream, like you have to understand that to know what Elvis is. So I think that's some of it.
Yeah, this is partly a right place, right time type of thing. Right in San Francisco with the Grateful Dead, with like Janis Joplin and all those people. So yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely. I wouldn't say I wouldn't recommend it because I think that there's definitely some strong enough stuff on here to listen to. But as a whole, there is also enough for me to be turned off from. So it's a mixed bag, I think, for me. So. Yeah,
same for me.
Read the lyrics to Coming Back to Me when you get a chance to. It's an anti-war song, and unlike a lot of the anti-war songs we've heard recently that are very direct in terms of it, it's a much more subtle anti-war song. And I think if you read the lyrics and what you're sort of viewing is the atonal nature of the song, and you think of it more as a score for an individual piece of writing, it might. I won't say you'll like it, but it'll make a lot more sense because let me just go with that. So maybe that's the best way to describe why I like Coming Back to Me is I was listening to it pretty quickly and I realized, okay, this is a Vietnam song and this is a Vietnam song from 1966. So that's, that's very early,
Right.
Right.
And being written from San Francisco. So that's where the context helps me a little bit for certain songs, but yeah. But I'll defend this one, I'm not saying you guys are in any way wrong. It's not going to be for everybody, but I'll defend this one. I think myself, and that I really enjoyed it.
Did it surprise you?
It only surprised me in the sense that with a title like "Surrealistic Pillow," I thought it was going to be more psychedelic.
It's a horrible title.
So I was prepared for it to be some of the tropes that I don't love of psychedelic, but. And that's the weird thing for me when I'm learning about psychedelic rock. It's like there's some I really like the United States of America, this album. Some of Santana has some, psychedelic elements too. I mean, we're going to cover Jimi Hendrix and he's got some, and I'm sure I'm not going to have a lot bad to say. And then there's some stuff that's almost unlistenable for me that's psychedelic.
Right.
So it constantly sort of forces me to not have preconceived notions going in. And I also love female lead singers. So and Grace Slick's one of the first true
she's got a great voice.
Female lead singers.
Yeah, that contralto is awesome.
Yeah. So just a couple of things to wrap up, because this is the only time we're covering Jefferson Airplane, or the Airplane, as they're affectionately known as. So there's a whole ton of CTS callbacks with this band going forward. So including Grace Slick having a brief relationship with Jim Morrison. Later, the band actually covered that David Crosby song Triad, which was one of the songs that he wanted to play with the Byrds, but the McGuinn and Hillman hated it, so they almost kicked him out because of it, or one of the reasons why they did. But they covered that about David Crosby's love of three-ways.
That comes up a lot with David Crosby. That seems to be like his thing.
He's a sex machine, man. He should be on that Sly Stone song. But Grace Slick also... Meh. Grace Slick actually collaborated with Frank Zappa on a song called "Would You Like a Snack," which is kind of on a Jefferson Airplane album in the background, and it sounds exactly like what you would think it would sound like. They also recorded "Wooden Ships," which was a song that we covered last week. That was partially written by Paul Cantor. Yep. That was recorded for their final album, their final classic the classic lineup album on 1969's Volunteers. Later on, the band disbanded. Cassidy and Kokkonen formed another band called Hot Tuna, which played off and on for many years. They actually played Bonnaroo several years ago, and I remember looking at that like, what the hell is Hot Tuna? I am not seeing that band.
Another horrible name for a band.
Yeah, that's a real bad name. It makes me kind of ill. They officially disbanded in late 1973, and while Hot Tuna was going on, Cantor and Slick went on to form the Jefferson Starship, and Bayland actually joined them later that year. And then in 1984, that band disbanded, and Grace Slick started Starship, which we all know for "We Built This City," Sarah, and "Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now," which
they're like they become one of several bands in the 80s that's completely unrecognizable from an earlier version of themselves, joining bands like Heart and Aerosmith in terms of their most popular critical work is also incomprehensible from their artistically.
Oh, it's totally
that was an
different
80s thing, yeah.
And I think reinvention.
I think Grace Slick was the only member from the original, really the classic lineup of Jefferson Airplane that was in Starship. Cantor, Bayland, and Cassidy went on to form another band called KBC Band, which I've never heard of. And in 1996, Jefferson Airplane were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But since then, there's been several deaths. Spencer Dryden died in 2005. Marty Bayland died in 2018. And Signe Anderson and Paul Cantor both died on the same day, January 28th, 2016. So they're starting to disappear.
Grace Slick also has one of my favorite quotes ever, and I remember hearing it for the first time when it actually aired. I think when I was in high school, maybe. VH1 had like a documentary. They were doing documentaries on famous bands. I think that was when the famous like Fleetwood Mac one came out, where everybody realized, holy shit, Fleetwood Mac was a mess, right? And that was one of the early Behind the Music, right? That was what it was called.
Yeah, VH1.
And they did one on Jefferson Airplane, and I remember she said that she had always known that she was going to retire from playing rock and roll at age 50, and she did. And she said something like, all rock and rollers over the age of 50 universally look stupid and should retire. And I remember laughing at that and saying, I agree with that idea. And now, 25 years later, I don't have any less agreement of that idea. And she's 100% right. So
pack it up, 50-year-olds. Your time is done.
Yeah, quit, Mick Jagger.
Yeah. Yep. She also, I just had to look it up because it's sad somehow when you watch people who are doing things that my daughter calls age inappropriate as rock and roll music was her other part of that, which is hilarious.
Oh, yeah. She had a daughter. Her kid is with Cantor. They had a relationship. She had a lot of relationships with different members of the band, but Cantor was kind of the one that she had a kid with. So
she loved freely.
She sure did. Yep. She sure did. So, all right. Well, I think that anybody else have anything else on the Airplane?
No.
Nope.
All right. Bon voyage, Airplane.